When I say normally, as I mentioned, in accordance with ADAPT 1000, the process would be that after an RFI was issued, the information would be evaluated, and then the next document to be issued would be a request for offer. However, at this stage, as I mentioned, there was an interim acquisition policy approved, and the STPs were just starting to come to fruition. And management instructed the joint project team that instead of issuing a request for offer, that a second request for information was issued. And I'd like to be specific here, the reason for that being, the STPPs brought in a different aspect to acquisition compared to the one that we were traditionally used to. And these additions were the requirement for national industrial participation, known as NIP, and defense industrial participation, known as DIP. And that was the only reason why a second RFI was issued and not gone straight into the request for offer process.
Now, Colonel, during the period when the South African Air Force was processing the acquisition program of the light utility helicopter, at that time, during that era, the Department of Defense was simultaneously engaged with the government, in discussion with the government in respect of the defense review. And ultimately, in 1998, the defense review was then adopted. Now, you have mentioned that the advent of the SDPP had a lot of influence, or had brought about some changes with regard to the acquisition process. Can you tell the Commission as to whether the process changed a lot even within the arm of service terrain, that is where the acquisition process is initiated, or did it change in respect of a different level or phase of acquisition?
Mr. Chair, the acquisition process per se did not really change. The management of the process was where it became different. There were different requirements that needed to be addressed, and the bodies in place for the, call it the old acquisition process, were not suitable to address the new requirements, as I mentioned, the NIPs, the DIPs, etc.
Thank you, Colonel. Yeah, you make reference to the NIPs and the DIPs at Ketera. Am I correct to say those considerations and factors would only feature within the arms corps domain, but as far as the arm of service is concerned, at the level of the arm of service prior to entering the arms corps terrain, the process would remain the same?
To answer both questions, Mr. Chair, the arm of service process would remain the same. The responsibility for the NIP and DIP were from two different divisions. The national industrial participation was the responsibility of the Department of Trade and Industry, whereas the defense industrial participation was an arms corps responsibility.
Now, shall we then proceed to deal with paragraph 9, which informs us about the second RFI?
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, the only change between the first RFI and the second RFI was that it was not sent to all the 16 institutions that the first RFI was sent to. Only the 3 finalists were considered for the second RFI, and the second RFI addressed nip and dip, which the first RFI did not address.
Colonel, will you please explain as to why the second request for information was only confined to the 3 shortlisted companies and it was not open to so many, the other 13?
Mr. Chair, if my memory serves me correctly, those were the only 3 offerers that complied fully to the requirements stipulated in the request for information. However, I believe that this should be verified when Armscor testifies, because, as I mentioned, this process lies directly within the Armscor domain.
Are you able to indicate, Colonel, as to whether the second RFI was tailored only to cater for the SDPP requirements, or whether you were at liberty to open the scope beyond the specified SDPP requirements?
Mr. Chair, the second RFI, as I mentioned, the technical requirements were identical to the first one. The only change was the SDPP's requirement for nip and dip. And as I mentioned, that is the only difference between issue 1 and issue 2 of the RFI.
Colonel, will you advise the Commission as to what was the outcome of the evaluation of the second RFI?
Mr. Chair, I quote from the JIT report, and in the bundle it is on page 110. Excuse me. I do apologize for that, Mr. Chair. My response comes from the JIT report, which is contained in page 110 of the bundle. And the paragraph reference is 5.3.3.5. And the 3 finalists, again in alphabetical order, was Augusta, Bell Textron Canada, and Eurocopter.
Now, shall we proceed to... You have also mentioned, I think in this paragraph, about the outcome as to what were your views with regard to the costs. What was the costs? What were the cost implications with regard to a specific bidder, in particular Augusta? Will you please inform the Commission about that?
Mr. Chair, I believe we're treading in dangerous territory here, that the request for information is not a binding document. So the information expressed there is more for information, as the document says. So I'd prefer not to go into the costing model here, and rather address this at a very superficial level. Also have an extract from the JIT report to address what is the binding offer once the RFO has been issued.
Thank you, Colonel. Shall we then proceed to deal with paragraph 11 of the statement, which now refers to the RFOs? You say there that on the 13th of February 1998, the request for offers, the RFO, for 60 units was issued, and the three were issued to the three shortlisted contenders. Will you please elaborate on that?
Mr. Chair, that is correct that the RFO was issued for 60 units. The reason being that the Alouette replacement study indicated that the replacement required 60 units as opposed to the 118 that were taken into service by the Air Force of the Alouette 3. And as was mentioned earlier, the force design and defense review had been approved at this stage, and the defense review also specified that 60 LUH should be acquired to replace the Alouette 3.
And will you also inform the Commission as to what was the outcome of the evaluation of the RFOs? Page 4 of your statement, Kenna.
Mr. Chair, my information is again extracted from the JIT report, and I refer to page 119 of the JIT report.
It is page 119 of bundle I, Mr. Chair, and the Commission.
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, my source documentation is the JIT report, page 119 of bundle I, and I refer to paragraph 5.4.1.6. And I will only read the final column of the evaluation results. When normalized, Augusta scored 100, Bell scored 64.6, and Eurocopter scored 80.8.
Right. Thank you. Are you able to tell the Commission as to what factors were taken into consideration for the evaluation of the offers? I'm asking this question quite cognizant of the fact that we are dealing with the Armscor terrain, Kenel.
Mr. Chair, my source document is again the JIT report, and I refer to page 110 of bundle I. Mr. Chairman, once again, the joint project team had specific responsibilities which did not include the NIP and the DIP side of the evaluation, neither the cost. The cost was done by a team from Armscor, and the NIP and DIP, as I mentioned earlier, was either one of the divisions of Armscor or the Department of Trade and Industry. However, the joint project team, amongst others, evaluated the following, and as I read from page 110, paragraph 3.3.7, we looked at the technical effectiveness of the proposed system, supportability right through its life cycle, value for money, risk associated with the tender, and then the last one is more in the NIP and the DIP environment, which is economical benefit and local participation.
Right. Thank you, Colonel. You have actually placed on record the factors that were taken into consideration in the evaluation in respect of the RFO, the response to the RFO. Now, for the completeness of the record, I would like to invite you to also, to an extent possible, place on record or inform the Commission about the factors that were taken into consideration during the evaluation process relating to the first request for information contenders. You may not, if possible, mention each, but give us an idea as to what factors were taken into consideration in the evaluation.
Mr. Chair, the factors considered in the evaluation, if I understand the question correctly in the RFI, would have been the same criteria except the last one, which would be the RSA economical benefit, which is contained in the NIP and the DIP.
The Colonel, you have indicated that the first RFI was sent out to about 16 companies and 3 were then shortlisted. Are you able to tell the Commission as to what factors were taken into consideration in order to ultimately narrow down the number to 3 during the very first request for information evaluation?
Mr. Chair, this process was followed in accordance with the Armscor acquisition process, where there was a value system used to measure the level of conformity of the response. And as I mentioned, that these value systems were approved under a strict Armscor control and were not to be tampered with until, or never to be tampered with, and only opened once the responses had been received. And this is the process that was followed on the whole acquisition process, to the best of my knowledge, for RFI 1, RFI 2, and the RFO.
Colonel, you say the valuation system would be approved and sealed or kept away, and it would never be tampered with or opened until the institution or the relevant committee had received the RFOs. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Do you have personal knowledge as to whether there was any interference or tampering with the approved evaluation process?
To the best of my knowledge, Chair, no.
Right, thank you. Whilst we are still on the evaluations, I'd like to find out from you, Colonel, as to at what stages would the flight evaluation be done, the technical evaluation be done? At what stage of the process would that be done?
Mr. Chair, this would be twofold. The flying evaluation is a very basic evaluation to understand the flying qualities of the machine. This was done shortly after the first RFI was issued, and a joint team once again visited the shortlisted companies where a test pilot flew the helicopters and evaluated the machine according to a test plan. The Arms Corps representatives investigated the credibility of the company, and this was the process that was followed to ensure that the three finalists satisfied the requirements in the acquisition process.
Colonel, you say the flight evaluation would be done just almost immediately after the shortlisting. Now, will you just inform the Commission as to whether the flight evaluation had the potential to eliminate any companies further, or you would have to live with the three shortlisted contenders to go to the next phase of evaluation?
Mr. Chair, the test pilot report would determine whether any of the bidders were suitable or unsuitable for further negotiations, and this would be taken into consideration. However, all three products were recommended for further negotiations.
Right, thank you. Will you then also inform us about the technical evaluation as to at what stage is that undertaken?
Mr. Chair, in the request for offer, the logistic requirement is specified in great detail, and a specific team of logistics specialists, both from Arms Corps and from the Air Force, would evaluate this proposal or the offer, and that would then be put into a value system, and the logistics response from each contender would then be measured.
Am I correct to say that the decision or the view taken that Augusta was the superior product as measured against the approved military value index was taken after the technical evaluation had been done?
That is correct, Mr. Chair. All the disciplines would have been evaluated by specialist teams, and the results of these evaluations would then be put into the formula which would finalize the military figure of merit.
Colonel, are you able to tell the Commission as to whether, maybe before I ask this question, let me just withdraw and rephrase. I now want to do a little bit of a comparative among the three shortlisted companies. And to an extent that you can give information, you may go ahead and do so. And where you can't, feel free to indicate that you can't. Are you able to tell the Commission about whether Bell was ever commissioned or not? And if it was never commissioned, are you able to give us reasons as to why it is so?
Mr. Chair, to the best of my knowledge, the Bell 427 that was proposed was never certified by the Federal Aviation Services of the United States. For what reason, I don't know. They did have orders. Whether any were delivered, I'm not sure. But I do know that the product was discontinued.
Do you know, are you able to tell us as to when the product was discontinued?
Mr. Chair, I don't have that information. However, should the Chair require it, it could be sourced and submitted should it be required.
Is there any information that you would like to bring to the attention of the Commission in respect of the Eurocopter?
Mr. Chair, both the Augusta and the Eurocopter bids were based on military variants. So both products existed, both had been certified. However, the difference being, in the Eurocopter case, that there was still development risks on the program. And these were considered in great detail, and the JIT report also does refer to a risk analysis that was done, and the penalties imposed on the products where risks were considered.
Thank you, Colonel. Shall we then proceed to paragraph 12 of the statement? And here you inform, or you state that a recommendation to the Cabinet that Augusta 109 was the best suited system to replace the Alouette 3 was accepted by Cabinet on the 18th day of November 1998. And approval for the negotiations to be entered with Augusta for the supply of 40 109 power variant was given. Can you indicate as to whether at this stage, once the approval was given by the Cabinet, whether the arm of service, in this case the South African Air Force, would also be at liberty to participate in the negotiations with the identified contender moving forward?
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, there was a joint project team comprising both Arms Corps and Air Force members, and this joint team would negotiate the various phases of the contract. There would be engineering specialists, there would be test pilot specialists, there would be logistics specialists, and obviously operational specialists. So these teams would enter into negotiations with their counterparts from the preferred supplier.
The acquisition, or rather the replacement of the Alouette resided in your project, that is Project Flange. Can you indicate as to whether, by virtue of you being the leader of the project, you would be, or you would form part of the joint teams that were established in order to negotiate with the Augusta company?
Mr. Chair, I was the leader of the Air Force contingent that was heading the evaluation process, and my equivalent would be from Arms Corps, and he would be the Arms Corps program manager, and under him he would have similar specialists to participate in the evaluation process.
Now, can you indicate, sir, as to whether in the negotiations you would also take into consideration, or rather you would also even engage in relation to the engine that should be supplied? I'm asking this in particular because you have already placed on record that Augusta offered two different engines, or a variant of two engines.
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned earlier, that originally the Air Force had no preference as to whether the LUH was equipped with the Pratt & Whitney engine or the Turbomeca engine. However, during the negotiation phase, the Air Force were concerned about the risk of the immature Turbomeca engine that was being offered.
What do you mean by the immature engine?
Mr. Chair, initially both suppliers, both Pratt & Whitney and Turbomeca, offered engines that had been certified. That means they had gone through the full engineering qualification process. However, when the alternative engine was offered, Pratt & Whitney had the only certified engine. The Turbomeca was still under development and was not certified, and this was the risk that the Air Force was concerned about.
Now, shall we then proceed to focus our attention to paragraph 13 of your statement, which deals with the process leading to the cabinet approval of procurement of 30 helicopters. Will you please take us through? Maybe before then, you mentioned right at the beginning of your statement that there were protracted negotiation. This was a protracted negotiation phase. Can you just give us an indication as to what contributed to this delay in the negotiations?
Mr. Chair, to the best of my knowledge, there was no delay. It was just a very intricate and complicated process to negotiate with an experienced OEM to ensure that what was included in the contract would satisfy the requirements as contained in our URS. And there was a lot of give and take. But I think at the end of the day, there was mutual agreement that the contract that was signed was for the best product to satisfy the end user's requirement.
Right, thank you, Colonel. You have mentioned that the negotiations were quite involved and also intricate, because you were negotiating with an experienced OEM. Can you just explain as to what OEM stands for?
My apologies, Mr. Chair. OEM is the acronym for Original Equipment Manufacturer.
Will you then take us through from the negotiation phase up until the signing of the contract on the 3rd day of December 1999 by then Minister Lekota.
Mr. Chair, the information from the negotiating phase was incorporated into a contract. This information was submitted via the relevant channels to Cabinet, and as was mentioned earlier, the quantities had been reduced substantially. Originally, the RFI and the RFO went out for 60 units. Cabinet approved contract negotiations for a quantity of 40 units. However, when the information was returned from Cabinet that a contract had been signed, it was only for 30 units.
Right. You mention in that paragraph that the contract price was fixed and this contract was signed with an option of an additional 10 helicopters to be procured at the original contracted price. But that option has never been exercised, and the option was open for only 2 years. Is there any comment that you'd like to make in respect of this information?
Mr. Chair, all I would like to say is that the contract price was fixed. There was no escalation to the contract. And to the best of my knowledge, this was agreed to with the OEM because of the relatively short duration anticipated for this program.
Shall we then proceed to the next paragraph, Kenneth? In this paragraph, you mentioned that soon after the effective date of signature, that is after the contract had been concluded and it took effect, Augusta decided to upgrade the A109 power helicopter to the A109 light utility helicopter. Will you please inform the Commission about the effect and impact of this upgrade to the South African Air Force, which will obviously also be to the South African National Defence Force?
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, both Eurocopter and Augusta offered variants of a certified civil helicopter. Once the contract had been signed, Augusta saw an option to improve the product that was offered to the South African Air Force by incorporating changes at no cost and to the benefit of the client. Without going into too much detail, I will list or mention a few of the changes proposed and accepted by the approval authorities within the project management domain. The rotor system, as mentioned, was from the traditional A109 power helicopter. Augusta had just recently certified a single-engined A119 Koala, which had a similar rotor system. However, it was less complex, more efficient, and lighter. And that particular rotor system was offered to Denel Aviation for manufacture, which would have improved our supportability. The other options that were offered was a new fuel system I alluded to the crashworthy, self-sealing tanks yesterday, which was incorporated into this new fuel system. There was a new hydraulic system offered. A different undercarriage was offered. The crashworthy aircrew seats that I alluded to yesterday were offered. And the Swedes had at this stage also signed a contract for 20 LUHs. And the Swedes' percentiles are, on average, a far taller individual than the average South African. And they requested that the aircrew door size be increased. And this was offered to us as well. However, the first helicopter that was delivered with the smaller door access. This was upgraded later, but thereafter the rest of the fleet had an increased door size. So apart from the new engine and the avionics suite that was being developed, these are some of the improvements that we got at no additional cost. And I can also mention that, unfortunately, these developments took time. But this played right into our hands insofar as that, in parallel to this, Turbomika was able to go through the traditional engineering process so that the first engine that was delivered was a certified engine, as opposed to the one that was proposed with the high risks.
Right, thank you, Kenneth. Shall we then turn to paragraph 15, where you mentioned that in May 2000 you moved to the Augusta helicopter facility in Italy. Will you please elaborate on that as to what the purpose of your Italy tour was, and whether it was only yourself or whether it was a team with different competency, and what benefit it served for you and, where applicable, and the team to be in Italy for the period.
Mr. Chair, once again, this was a joint team comprising members from Arms Corps and from the Air Force, and both organizations had different requirements, and yet some of them were similar requirements from the management perspective. I was there as the operational specialist and the overall manager, and my counterpart was the Arms Corps program manager. There were engineers from both the Air Force and Arms Corps. There were logistics specialists from both Arms Corps and the Air Force. Because the quality assurance responsibility belongs to Arms Corps, the Air Force did not have a quality assurance member. And just before the first aircraft became available for flight testing, the test pilot joined the team. And it sounds like a fairly big team, but if one considers the complexity of all the new developments that were taking place, had it just been the original aircraft, I think the engineering effort would not have been as large as it was during this phase. So there were continual design reviews, approval of these design reviews, negotiations where there was disagreement in the design reviews, and there was an interactive process between the OEM representatives and the joint project team while in Italy.
Colonel, the project has not as yet been finalized. You are now back at the helm and you are finalizing the project. Am I correct?
Mr. Chair, the answer is yes and no. As I mentioned yesterday, all the equipment, components, and training aids that were included in the original acquisition plan have been delivered to the Air Force, are in service currently. However, during the operational test and evaluation, there were certain shortfalls identified, and orders have been placed to satisfy these requirements. Some of the components have already been delivered, as I mentioned yesterday, that the mountings for the self-protection machine guns have been delivered, and they are in the process of going through the operational test and evaluation. The slaving mechanism for the observation system and the searchlight has been delivered and is in the initial stages of the operational test and evaluation. And the outstanding issues are only the ones outside of the original acquisition plan. So phase 1, in accordance with the original acquisition plan, is closed. It is the few outstanding issues that still need to be closed, and then obviously the final closure report, the final deviation report, and the traditional documents required once a program is being wound up that are still outstanding.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that it is now 12:40, and I request for a short adjournment, the 15 minutes adjournment, before I turn to the next phase of the evidence.
We'll adjourn for